Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Other people may join us, but I want to welcome everybody and thank you all for coming this morning. In just over 3 weeks, Chile will have a new president as Michelle Bachelet of Nueva Mayoría completes her second term and Sebastián Piñera of Vamos Chile takes over, starting his second term. He had served as president from 2010 to 2014. Piñera takes office having handily defeated Alejandro Guillier in the second round on December 17th. When I had an opportunity to ask President Piñera at a meeting we had with him in September if he was worried about the curse of second terms, he said with great confidence that his first term was very successful and his second term will even be more successful. Both presidents, both Piñera and Bachelet, I should mention, are members of the Inter-American Dialogue. This morning, we're going to look at a number of questions as Piñera gets ready to take office and start a new administration. First, how should we interpret his win on December 17th? What should we expect going forward? Does this mean, as many journalists have written, that Chile has moved to the right, part of a wider regional trend? Or is Chile justifying a more global trend of electing protest candidates? And perhaps the biggest surprise to me, in any rate, of this whole election in Chile was the strong vote in the first round in November of the Frente Amplio, Beatriz Sanchez, nearly making it to the second round. Will the widespread disenchantment with politics as usual in Chile, especially among young people, pose a problem for governance in Piñera's second term? And how will he get through his pro-growth legislative agenda without having a majority in Congress? Should we expect basically more of the same? Reform will be modest, gradual, piecemeal, and not moving in any radical direction. In an environment in which there appears to be a desire for change, will Piñera just deliver continuity? So there are a lot of questions to explore, and fortunately we have a terrific group of speakers who will offer different perspectives on these and other questions, and then we'll open it up and have a good exchange with all of you. There's a lot of people in this room with a lot of interest in Chile and a lot of knowledge about Chile as well. I want to recognize first friends from the Chilean embassy who are with us this morning. Unfortunately, Ambassador Valdez is out of Washington, so he was not able to be here. So let me introduce the three speakers in the order in which they'll speak as you begin to prepare your challenging questions and your wise comments for the discussion period. Robert Funk is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Institute for Public Affairs, University of Chile. He served as the Institute's Deputy Director from 2009 to 2013. His research areas include democratization, ideology, and political elites. He consults on Latin American political risk for a variety of government, private sector institutions. Frequent commentator and columnist in Chile and international media. He's a columnist writes a monthly column for Capital in Chile. So we're thrilled to have Robert here. First time, he's been at the Dialogue, but the first time in this new office. So we're delighted to have him. Sergio Zua is the Associate Professor of the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and an international research fellow at the Centro Latinoamericano de Políticas Económicas y Sociales at the Catholic University in Santiago. He's done extensive research on labor markets, pensions, skills development in Latin America. He has spoken at the Dialogue before, but I don't think on this particular, on Chile. He's spoken on other issues. He's also a columnist for El Mercurio. So we're thrilled to have Sergio with us as well. And finally, Gabrielle Tribat, who's at McClarty Associates. She's a regional director and part of the Brazil Southern Cone practice at McClarty. She has been there since 2011. Before that, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Business Affairs, Public Liaison at the U.S. Treasury Department, where she oversaw outreach to the private sector, labor, NGO communities. She's a dual national of Brazil and the United States, and also served as Executive Director of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, where she was responsible for promoting a strong bilateral trade and investment relationship. And we want to welcome Gabrielle. She is going to focus more on how foreign investors are viewing and seeing and the expectations they have for this change in government under Piñera. So thank you very much for joining us. Each will speak for about 10, 12 minutes and with opening comments, and then we'll invite all of your questions. So thank you all for coming, and I'll turn the floor over to Robert.
Thank you, Michael. We're short on time, so I'm going to basically divide my remarks in two. The first is what we knew going into the election. What was the context that we knew, or the known unknowns that we knew going into the election? And then there were a bunch of unknown unknowns that became a bit clearer after the election, and looking back, which I think helped to explain what happened and how we got to where we are. And then a few remarks about some thoughts on where we are going forward. What we knew going into the election, we knew this would be an unusual election. And we knew that there were unknown unknowns, or there were known unknowns, which was the fact that the electoral system had changed. We had shifted away from what we call the binomial system. Funnily enough, and from a political science point of view, the electoral system, everyone talked about a reform to the electoral system. It hadn't really changed. They didn't really change the electoral system per se. The actual system is the same, which is the Daunt system, which redistributes votes and tries to correct the distribution in order to make it more proportional. But what did change was the binomial part of it. In other words, we went from lists of 2 seats per district to a range of, I believe, 2 or 3 to up to 8 seats per district. And obviously, when you do that, you do 2 things. First is you open up the system to new actors. You allow for more lists, and therefore you get rid of the incentive which we had for the last 30 years of keeping the party system organized into 2 big blocks. And the second thing you do is you lower the bar for entry. So if you have a district of 8 seats, you have you can win a seat with maybe 20% of the vote, and in some cases, as we saw, even less, because the lists dragged small candidates into the Congress. And that's something that the Frente Amplio in particular was very good at doing. So we knew that and the other thing that happened with the electoral reform was that they increased the number of seats, both in the House and in the Senate. Basically, that was done as a kind of hook in order to get the Congress people to approve the reform. They thought, well, if we increase the number of seats, then the chances are less that we'll lose our own seats, and we'll vote for it. So the House of Deputies went from 120 to 155 seats. The Senate went from 38 to 43 seats. And eventually, I believe it'll go to 45 seats. So we knew that the change in the electoral system would be a game changer for the political system, and it was. The second thing that we knew going into the election was the problems that the Nueva Mayoría, which is the coalition which used to be the Concertación and became the Nueva Mayoría, with the inclusion of the Communist Party and other small groups, we knew that they were going into this election in a disadvantage. It was internally divided. Bachelet was not very popular. Her reforms were not very popular. And their own constituent parties were fighting amongst themselves. The Christian Democrats were, for all intents and purposes, had left the coalition. They ran their own presidential candidate. So they were internally divided, unpopular, and trying to sell unpopular policies, right? So then And then we had the results that Michael alluded to in the first round, which were also strange. We had the sudden emergence not only of the Frente Amplio doing very well, but you also had on the right the emergence of the two castes, José Antonio Cast and Felipe Cast. Felipe Cast ran as a kind of moderate, center-right, young, liberal in the Chilean sense, candidate in primaries. And José Antonio Cast ran as a kind of heir to the Pinochetista right. And he actually, and they both did surprisingly well. And what was the real surprise was José Antonio Cast, who in the first round, not in the primaries, but in the first round, got roughly 8 to 10% of the vote. And to me, actually, more than the Frente Amplio's result, I think that was interesting, at least. It was something to watch for, because in Chile generally, and my presentation in particular, we focus a lot on the Nueva Mayoría and what's happening with the communists, what's happening with the Christian Democrats. But I think there's some interesting things going on with the parties on the right as well, and things to watch for. Well, the results, as we know, I'm not going to get into that because I don't have time, but to sum it up, I mean, the real challenge in terms of the results is that nobody can claim victory. Everybody claimed victory. When nobody can claim victory, everybody can claim victory. And that's sort of what happened. And we had this very strange scene after the first round where the Nueva Mayoría and Bachelet seemed very happy. And basically their candidate had obtained like 23% of the vote. And they said, this is a great show of support for our reforms. And I was looking at this saying, well, how do you figure? Well, what they were figuring was that their vote plus the Nueva Mayoría's vote summed up to this almost 45, almost 50% support, and therefore all these polls that had come out in the previous years indicating that people were not happy with the electoral reform, with all these reforms that they were trying to implement, not electoral reform, education reform, pension reform, tax reform, it showed that that wasn't true and that there was a great vote of confidence for their reforms. But what happened in Congress is that because the coalitions are so divided, nobody has a majority. The right is close to a majority, and I think actually there's one result that has not been commented very much, which is that one of the interpretations of the election result was that the Christian Democratic Party did very badly. Certainly the presidential candidate did very badly for the Christian Democrats, which is historically a very important party both within the Concertación and in Chile. But if you look at, they got something like 13 seats in the Senate, I believe. I've got the numbers here. If you add up the presence of the Christian Democrats, both in the Senate and the House, what that shows is that they really become the important swing vote for the right to get its agenda passed. So one of the questions that you asked, which is what possibility Piñera has to get his agenda through Congress, to a large extent that will depend on the Christian Democrats, assuming that Piñera chooses to go through Congress. And I think as much as he can, he's going to try to do as much as possible outside of Congress. Executive orders. And certain things can be done outside of Congress without going through Congress. Other things cannot. What that also means is that some of the important reforms are probably, even if Piñera opts to go ahead with them, most notably the constitutional reform, the kind of majorities that you need to get something like a constitutional reform approved in Congress will be very, very difficult given the composition of Congress. So I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm just going to go fast forward to a bit of an interpretation of how do we interpret what happened in Chile. And I think there the key is that Chile is undergoing three great shifts. The first shift is a shift in the party system, to the political parties and party system, not dissimilar to what we've seen in many other countries in Europe and the United States, where on the one hand political parties just somehow no longer seem relevant to a lot of voters in general. Voters don't like parties, are suspicious of parties. And then in the Chilean context as well, where you have the basic dissolution of the Concertación and the Nueva Mayoría, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And also on the right, where you see the emergence of people like Cast, who are also, or the two Casts, who are challenging the traditional parties of the right. So that's the first shift. The second is shift in political leadership, right? People are looking towards, as is happening in other countries in the world, looking towards new kinds of political leaderships, not traditional political leaders. Bachelet, to some degree, was the first hint of this in 2004. 2004-05, where if you look at her language at that time, where she talked about Gobierno Ciudadano, there was a kind of intuition, or maybe they had numbers, I don't know, that her language was very much geared towards her leadership being hers and not coming out of the party system, right? That's only become more marked in the last 10 years or so. And so we see the emergence of new leaders who don't come from the traditional parties. People like the former student leaders who have now gone into Congress, or people like José Antonio Cast, who wasn't a party but is challenging the parties. Also, Manuel José Osandón, who, again, has been in politics for a while, but even in the first Piñera government was a constant kind of critic of Piñera. His approach has been much more populist, and it actually works. And in fact, between the first and second round, for Piñera to obtain Osandón's endorsement, Piñera had to commit to keeping the part of Bachelet's education reform, which was the free tuitions, which is something that was absolutely anathema to the right. But Osandón, the populist side of Osandón, said, we need to keep this in order to move forward. And the third big shift, and I think this is the most important one, and I'll come back to it, is a demographic and economic shift in general in the Chilean population, which has resulted in new political views, a much more liberal electorate, an electorate that doesn't understand why we have the parties we do, why we have the political liberal we do. Liberal in the U.S. In the U.S. sense, and generational shift, and this is key, and a generational shift. If you think that those of us who teach in universities, my first year students were born in 2000, so there's a 10-year. There are now a bunch of young voters from 1990 to 2000. So from the end of the dictatorship to 2000 were people who are now voting and operating in a system that still has Pinochet's constitution, Pinochet's political parties, Pinochet's economy, Pinochet's healthcare system. That's how they see it. They see it as Pinochet's. And that's very important. I think that's a generational shift. So when you look at what political preferences are and what the demands are, we are now in a situation, and I think this election reflects it, where there's this kind of conversación entre sordos, where there are just two conversations going on and they don't meet at the same place at all. I remember a conversation, a debate on TV with our friend Sergio Vidal and a student leader around 2013. And the student leader was saying to Sergio, you're the generation that sold out and you accepted Pinochet's constitution and you didn't put him in jail and Sergio lost it a little bit and he said, what are you talking about? We went to jail and we struggled for democracy and we fought so that you could have the right to go out onto the street and say the things that you're saying now. And well, of course they're both right. But those two conversations don't meet. And that's where that's the political conversation as well. That generational shift, I think, much more than left and right, much more than liberal, Chilean liberal or American liberal or conservative or whatever, that's really the new cleavage in Chilean politics. And so if you listen to their demands, this is the great challenge for the parties. And this is where the three things that I mentioned at the beginning, they all meet. How do parties respond? Parties are still basically come out of this left-right dynamic, right? And the center is a great challenge for the political center. I worked with Andrés Velasco, who tried to put forward a centrist message. The Christian Democrats, who see themselves as centrist, they don't seem to have a lot of space. Why? Because the center only makes sense when in a spatial dynamic which is left-right. If left-right no longer makes sense, then what's the center? And so what's the new left-right? It's generational. It's people who say, and if you look at what young people want, they are socially liberal. They sound economically left-wing, but they're very consumerist. So they want free education, but they also want private universities because they understand that we went to 1.5 million university spots because of the existence of private education. They want to go to the mall, but they don't want to pay interest rates on their credit card. So there's this strange mix of things. Some people would call them the children of Pinochet. But it's certainly not the kind of political demands that we're used to, and the political parties are not able to respond. And just to finish, so how do things look going forward? I think it's the end of the Concertación / Nueva Mayoría. The Concertación was a coalition formed to overthrow Pinochet. It stayed in power because the electoral system was an incentive to stay in power. It stayed in power or stayed together because it knew that it had the great challenge of getting past the transition and proving governability for the left and so on. Things that you all know about. By 2009, and this is one of the interesting things that now looking back make a lot of sense, but at the time perhaps didn't. In 2009, the Concertación was finished. It had no leadership, so it chose Eduardo Frei. It had no real platform, and so it lost. But they had one thing up their sleeves, which was Bachelet, leaving office with 80% approval, and then going off to New York. And they said, we don't really have to look for new leadership, and we don't have to really think our program because Bachelet will come back in 4 years. And she did, and she won. During that time, you get the student movement. Bachelet comes back, no leadership renovation, and no programmatic renovation, because what they did was they sort of adopted the student demands. We'll have a little bit of free education, and we'll have a new constitution, and we'll have a bit of this and bit of that. I'm moving around too much.
You want to start from the beginning?
I was born. They had no program and no leadership. But they had Bachelet's popularity. And then came Penta, and then came corruption, and Bachelet's popularity went down, and the only thing they had left was this kind of semi-program, which is an adoption of the student demands, but without really thinking over implementation, without really thinking over the costs and the political challenges and so on. And today, 4 years later, that's finished. Bachelet is no longer there. The reform agenda is kind of badly implemented, not very popular. So the Concertación, I think, is absolutely finished, and we're going to see now, we don't know, how that's going to regroup. We have the emergence of the Nueva Mayoría, of the Frente Amplio. Is that the new left? Is that where is the center left? So the Frente Amplio also is a very diverse group of parties, including the Liberal Party, Chilean Liberal. But the Liberal Party is aligned with this group of people asking for a range of things, from environmental issues to free education to constitutional reform, and in some cases even nationalizing copper mines. Not to speak of lithium, that's a whole other interesting thing. So I think that's the thing to watch in the coming up period. What happens to the parties in the Concertación, and in general, how the party system regroups. What happens to social movements? I think that Piñera, the next 4 years are not going to be very smooth. Expectations have been created. Social movements, probably the student movement, will probably not be as strong as it was the first time around, because what else can they ask for? But it'll show up again. Labor strife will show up again, because they need to go against Piñera. And interestingly, and I'll finish on this point, the right seems to be doing the same thing that the left did 4 years ago, which is we're not really rethinking programmatically. And we've got Piñera, so we won the election. We didn't have to look for new leadership. So as long as Piñera's around, in 4 years down the road, Piñera will no longer be the leader. And that will be this point where the parties of the right and different groups on the right need to choose where they're going to go. And is it going to be GAS number 1 or GAS number 2 or Osandón or what are they going to do? So I think that in light of this these new political cleavages, the shifts in the party system and these coalitions, and also in light of the new electoral system, will be what happens in politics over the next 4 years.
Great. Thank you, Robert. That was excellent. Thanks for getting us off to a great start. Sergio.
All right. So first of all, thank you, Michael, for having me here at the dialogue. So let me, I will probably complement what Robert mentioned, and of course, from an economic perspective. I will try to use an economic perspective to do that. But let me start. I think it's important to look at the numbers. And when it comes to the election, how big was the win of Piñera? I think it's something we should, remember. So Piñera got basically 3.8 million votes in the runoff, after obtaining 2.4 million votes in the first round. Compared to what Bachelet got back in 2013, that was 3.4 million votes. So he actually got more votes than Bachelet in 2013. Back in 2009, Piñera got 3.6 million votes, so he himself. And back in 2005, when Bachelet got her best result, it was 3.7 million votes. So actually, Piñera, in a context of voluntary voting, this is, remember, this is a big change that Robert was referring to. Piñera's result is superb, no question about it. So what happened, right? So what happened now? And again, this is, I think, it's based on the economics plays an important role here. So let me illustrate this. So we should not be doing statistics with one observation, but let me give you a sort of perspective of what I think is going on with sort of my experience. So I was born in Chile in 1977. The country has a per capita income back in 1977 of $4.5 thousand. That's what Tonga has today. When I was 15, the country had a per capita income of $8,000. That's sort of Colombia. Full story income. So it was a trap. So Chile needs to continue the transition from a closed, open society to an open access society. And that progress cannot be delayed or disrupted. And when it comes to the result of the election, I think that was exactly what happened. I think, for many, the results came as a surprise. But to be honest, I don't think it came to a surprise to the strong emerging middle class, eager to secure its progress. I think that's exactly what happened. So what did Piñera win in December? So we need to see Bachelet's legacy. So what happened? I have a few numbers here so to see why this middle class, eager to continue its progress, right, felt that things were not going the way they were expected to go during these last 4 years. So average GDP growth was 1.9% per year since 2014, by far the lowest we observed in any administration since 1990, and actually you got to go back to the 60s to find something like that. Comparison to Piñera got an average per capita, average growth, GDP growth of 5.3% between 2010 and 2013. Due to the 2014 reform, corporate taxes in Chile are now the highest in the region, 27%. Almost half of the new jobs under the Nueva Mayoría administrations are explained by a massive rise of public employment. Between 2014 and 2017, annual formal job creation reached 23,000 under the Nueva Mayoría, with Piñera almost 200,000, 178,000 per year. Labor legislation has become a heavy burden in light of the new industrial revolution. Direct foreign investment has steadily declined since August 2013. Public debt doubled in 4 years, from 12.7% in 2013 to a projected 23% in 2017. While in 2011, 23,000 families live in slums, now the number reached 38,000. Quality of education is not guaranteed, even though tertiary education has expanded, right? And to a large extent is totally disconnected from the productive needs of the country. And this poor performance has implications. If you look at the numbers, had Chile's economy expanded, say, by 3.5%, sort of, it's still not the historic rate, the government revenues would have increased by $7 billion by 2017. Just sort of the amount it was reported early on in 2014 as the extra revenues that will result from the tax reform. So we lost, basically the country lost the same money it was supposed to be collected due to this reform. So I really think that at the end, what we saw back in December, it was the manifestation of this middle class that got tired. I mean, you look at the reforms, the popularity of the reforms for years, since the very beginning. You know, more than 50% of people are reporting they're not happy with them. Labor reform, tax reform, education reform, all of them, across the board. It's unbelievable. So even if you look at, for example, the result of Frente Amplio, which I think is very interesting to see. So I think that they also emerge as a manifestation of this phenomenon. So where are the votes from Frente Amplio coming from? So Frente Amplio got 4% of votes in the 10 most poorest municipalities of the country, 9% in the richest municipalities in the country. 40% of their votes, of Beatriz Sanchez's votes, come from only 20 municipalities. All of them are middle-class municipalities. Maipú, Quilicura, La Florida, there she got the vast majority of the votes, which is actually quite unbelievable when it comes to the logic of Sanchez's positions and how those demands match with sort of the needs of the country's needs. So what happened in the runoff with Sanchez's votes is also, I think, interesting to understand what are the challenges Piñera is going to be facing. So out of Sanchez's votes, 64% of the votes went to Guiller, 10.5% to Piñera, 1 out of 10, not bad actually. And 25% they did not show up. So how do we read these results? Well, I think still, if you go back to Sanchez's main propositions are basically, exactly what Robert was saying. Let's continue with free education. Let's try to expand social benefits. A lot of benefits, but very few rights. A lot of rights, but not a lot of obligations. And I think that's the challenge that Piñera will be facing during the next few years. How to adjust the economy, how to think of the deficit in an economy that, it's still the richest economy in the region, but doesn't have the financial situation that he embedded back in 2010. So when it comes to what he will be doing during the next few years, I don't think he will be able, because of this, right, this combination of large demands, right, to continue expanding the benefits, and at the same time, the needs to reduce the deficits. I don't expect to find Piñera involved in large economic reforms. So there won't be reforms to reforms. There will be changes, and there are a lot of room for improvements, that for sure. But probably we will see some changes in the tax legislation that's actually needed. It's just a mess. I mean, firms, nobody knows how to pay taxes. It's just super complicated. What I mentioned, the 27% corporate rate, actually that's the minimum. It could go up to 44% depending on how you set up your business. Which is, for the region again, when you see what Peru is doing, what Colombia is doing, what the US is doing, right, competing at those rates is going to be very hard. When it comes to foreign investments, the country needs to go back and revisit sort of the basics, the foundations. I mean, Chile thought that by changing the law, we have the Decreto 600, right? That Decreto 600 was basically the law that secures investments for firms, right, to go into the country. That's gone. And we have seen a steady decline of investments during the 4 years. And so the country needs to find how to reverse the situation. But more importantly, I think at the end, is for Piñera to figure out how to secure the transition of Chile from these ideas of a closed society, where merit-based progress is not secure, where people can access to institutions without any considerations in terms of origins or race or gender, right? So an open access society where merit-based is sort of the way things should work, right? Law is enforced, security, right? Police is efficient, and that process, when you look at the 20th century, actually, very few countries were able to go that way, to transit from a closed society to an open access society. And most of them did it under dictatorships, actually, in the 20th century. So Chile has a challenge, and Piñera, I think, he understands that in order to continue Chile's progress, you need to figure out how to do it in the context of a democracy. And unfortunately, there's really no example to follow. Chile needs to build their own path, like its own path. And I think Piñera, you look at the people he's being the cabinet, right? They have a lot of experience. Most of them were back in the government in 2010. It's because he understands that this needs to start right away. So March 12th, that's the first day of the new administration. The administration needs to be functioning. Why? Well, because this challenge of facing these demands, the economic situation is not the same we faced 10 years ago, 4 years ago. He needs people with experience. We won't see reforms to reforms, but I'm sure we will see a significant effort for improving some of the things that were that affected at the end the performance of the economy during the last 4 years.
Great. Terrific. Thank you, Sergio, very much. Gabrielle, tell us how Chile is seen from the outside.
The business crystal ball. So thank you so much, Michael, for the invitation. As Michael mentioned in the introduction, I'm with McCarty Associates, and we work with foreign investors, multinational companies invested all over the world. But I'm here to talk about sort of how foreign investors are viewing Chile, how they're viewing the Piñera administration, what we can expect from the Piñera administration in terms of their efforts to attract investment. And last, I'll touch a little bit on Chile's increasingly influential role in global trade and in this sort of brave new world that we're in right now in terms of trade policy. So how the investor community is viewing Piñera 2.0. I think there's a recognition that Piñera this time around is going to be a lot different than 1.0 with respect to his approach to governance and relations with the business community. I think it's a recognition in the business community that societal pressures on Piñera are a lot more intense. He's going to have to be very careful to avoid the sins of the first term, where he was viewed as much more close to sort of CEOs and executives than he was to the people. And I think really his appointment of Alfredo Moreno-Chahmy as the Minister of Social Development really reflects this, as well as his campaign pledges to expand that ministry's breadth and reach and create new undersecretary, for social services. Really shows that he's committed to making sure, committed to correcting this perception that hung over his first term like a shadow. So that said, investors are cautiously optimistic, I would say, foreign investors, that he will be able to revisit some aspects of Bachelet's tenure that made life a little bit complicated. One, mentioned already by Sergio, is corporate tax reform. I think they're going to be looking or hoping that he does something on regulatory reform, regulatory coherence, regulatory transparency, labor reform, aspects of that, and in general, the dialogue with industry. That said, I think that investors are very sanguine that he's going to have some limited space to maneuver. It's a brave new world in Chile as well. And that he's going to have to address some ongoing societal dissatisfaction with the pension system and the healthcare system and the education system. And he's going to have to find a way to thread that needle to address some of the social concerns while avoiding major structural changes that will deter private investment. And I think this recognition on Piñera's part is due to a couple of reasons. One, unlike many other countries in Latin America, Chile is a country where there are deeply integrated public-private solutions to social needs, like education, like pensions, like healthcare. And because of Chile's status as a very open, globalized economy, there's a lot of foreign investment in Chile. So disruptions to the system are going to have to be very carefully considered. Two, I think Piñera appreciates, and for what it's worth, Bachelet did as well too, that there are a lot of eyes on Chile. What happens in Chile tends to get exported, in the region. Chile's always punched above its weight, and I think there is, Chile is sort of universally recognized in the region as sort of a model for its economic integration, et cetera. And so investors pay really close attention, and Piñera knows this, about what happens in Chile, because they know it could be copycatted elsewhere in the region. So for all these reasons, I think that Piñera is going to proceed very cautiously with some of these reforms, but what investors are expecting he's going to have to tackle, probably relatively early on in his tenure, is one, certainly pension or reform of the AFP system. And this is a sector with a lot of foreign investment. I think what we can expect is not a wholesale structural change, but the introduction of greater competition, greater amount of stakeholders, a greater role for the public system in the delivery of pensions in Chile. And the ultimate goal really will be to improve pension payments, to focus a lot on lower socioeconomic classes, to focus on women. I think we can expect some minimum increases in retirement ages and contribution rates as well. So that is something that I think a lot of foreign investors are expecting to happen. Two, and another area of growing foreign investment is in healthcare. I think investors are expecting that he's going to have to do something on healthcare reform. And specific to the ISAPRES of the private system, I think we can expect probably there'll be some efforts to end medical risk discrimination, which is the resistencias that it currently exists. I think probably he could do something to improve mobility between the ISAPRES for people that are beneficiaries. I think there's going to be a lot of effort to ensure greater affordability of the system. Chile has one of the highest out-of-pocket expenditures on healthcare costs in Latin America. And so I could see Piñera, and he did this his first time, so I think we shouldn't be surprised if he does it again, which is to, on drug prices, for example, promote the role of generics and bioequivalent drugs to kind of bring down or help control for some of those costs as well, among some other initiatives. Regulatory reform is another area that investors are hopeful, cautiously hopeful, I should say, that Piñera will address. And really, it's not so much reform as a return of Chile's return to OECD standards and principles and best practices when it comes to advance notice and comment, when it comes to public consultation periods. I think in the past few years, Chile's got a little bit away from this behavior, and it's something that has impacted foreign investment in a way that I think perhaps is a little bit underappreciated by the current government. And last, I think investors do expect a return to more, I would say, consistent stakeholder inclusion in major policy reforms. Chile's always been very thoughtful and deliberate about pulling together commissions to do studies, to analyze, social challenges, and include all the stakeholders, et cetera. But then what we have seen is a trend to, once the process now moves into the legislative drafting stage, there's some asymmetries of inclusion. So I think there's an expectation among investors that throughout the process, there'll be greater consultations with them in the development of that draft legislation. Which brings me to the politics, which both Robert and Sergio have already discussed, but I'll just share a little bit that I think the business community is very cognizant that of the major shift in the congressional elections, particularly in the lower house with the introduction of Frente Amplio as a new sort of wild card. And I think they know that Piñera will be dealing not just with one opposition, but maybe two or more oppositions in Congress. And this, of course, also explains his choice of about half a dozen politicians in his current cabinet makeup, right? And in sort of very sensitive ministries like justice, defense, labor, mining, natural resources, housing, et cetera. So I think there's an awareness that to get anything done, his cabinet is going to have to be as political as it is technocrat. But I think Piñera will have an advantage in that his politics have tended to be very pragmatic, and his political trajectory has bent towards pragmatism. But it's new territory. He's going to have to kind of navigate it very carefully and thread that needle between the art of the possible and what he thinks is in the best interest long-term of Chile. So this brings me a little bit to what, I've shared a little bit what investors are expecting, but what I think Piñera will likely do in his first few months in office with regards to boosting investor confidence. As was mentioned by Sergio, Piñera is going to have to balance sort of this need to respond to societal demands with the realities of fiscal pressures. And copper prices, have recovered, but not to the levels they really need to be. And despite Chile's efforts to diversify away from copper, it still represents, I think, close to 50% of its exports. So they're still in some tight fiscal skirts, as they say in Brazil, still as he begins his tenure. I think we can expect in the very early months that the economy minister, José Ramón Valente, will lead this effort. It was described to me, I was in Santiago last week, as sort of investment shock therapy, doing some dialogues with industry to figure out what the government can do to attract, to improve the levels of investment. Piñera has stated his goal is to increase private investment by 3% in the first 4 years. Because at the end of the day, if the economy doesn't pick up, then nothing else really matters. There's going to be, I think, a big push on infrastructure financing. Piñera pledged on the campaign about $30 billion to modernize and improve rails and roads, and also focus, I think, on digital infrastructure. Tax reform. I think this is an area we can also expect some movement by Piñera to both simplify and to address the corporate tax rate. As we all know, it was increased during the Bachelet years to 27, although as Sergio mentioned, the effective rate can be a lot higher than that. I think we may see Piñera try to reduce it a little bit to more competitive levels. But this, I think, will be the first real challenge of his ability to cobble a coalition. Though that increase in the corporate tax rate that happened under Bachelet helped bring in some much-needed revenue to fund some very important social programs. So I think the left, it could be a non-starter for the left, I think, for him to do something really ambitious on the tax rate ultimately. But he could do some things on simplification. Labor reform, I think there'll be some efforts to repeal some aspects of Bachelet's labor reform. He may try to decrease a little bit the role of the unions, increase the ability of individuals to either individually or collectively to negotiate in collective bargaining. But again, I think this is going to be very hard, and investors are aware of this, in an environment where unionization rates have increased, where we now have 12,000 active unions. We have more than 1 million new workers that have been unionized. So this will be a challenge. And now I think I can just conclude my remarks talking a little about trade and what we can expect in terms of Chile's role in global trade over the coming years. Definitely, I think we can absolutely expect that Piñera will continue to uphold Chile's leadership role on the global stage with respect to trade. I don't have to tell you, I think you all know very well here that Chile, despite its relatively small population, has been a regional leader on trade and integration, and it has, I think, over 50 preferential trade agreements with 60 countries all over the world. And it's been really a major force in getting the TPP-11 over the finish line and on integration efforts with the Pacific Alliance. We all know the key role that Chile played in the TPP after the Trump administration pulled the US out of those discussions last year. Chile really played an outsized role in last March in the Viña del Mar summit negotiations, which really got TPP back on track after the US reversal. And throughout the negotiations, Chile played, I think, again, an outsized role in overcoming complex issues among very diverse constituencies to reach an agreement last month. And I think the selection of Chile as the country where they'll be signing the agreement on March 8th, I think really is a testament to the role that Chile has played in the TPP. In the Pacific Alliance, I think also with Piñera, we can expect Chile to continue its efforts to support and strengthen. I think we can see Piñera probably accelerate efforts to establish a timetable for associate members to become incorporated into the Pacific Alliance. Just this month, the Pacific Alliance held its second round of negotiations in Australia, and Chile is really helping to lead that effort to incorporate Australia and Singapore and Canada into the Pacific Alliance. I think we can also see Piñera seek to advance the customs union's agreement among the member countries, promote further regulatory harmonization, and of course, deepen the integration with Mercosur. The next round of the Pacific Alliance negotiations will also be in Chile on March the 5th, I believe, just a few days before the TPP signing. And really, I think Chile's role in shepherding the Pacific Alliance in a year where we're going to see elections in 2 other member countries, in Mexico and Colombia, which, and by the way, Peru is still having, I think, a little bit of an unstable political outlook for this year, I think says a lot to our dependence upon Chile, frankly, continuing to see the Pacific Alliance through. Lastly, I'll just mention that Chile will be hosting the APEC Summit next year as well, as part of its effort to continue to oversee efforts to promote integration with the Asia Pacific. So I think that's my overview.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Well, thank you. We've heard 3 different perspectives and set of comments, and maybe we can open up and collect some questions for our speakers. Let me just start with 2 questions, if I could. One is, if we had a session on any other country and a new government, the word corruption would be mentioned. I don't think it was mentioned in this session, and yet, of course, this was an issue for Bachelet. It's something that's more in the public sort of consciousness and in Chile and elsewhere. Certainly this is not the scale of Brazil, and it's not. We know that, but is this relevant at all in terms of the politics, the corruption issue? And the second is, Sergio was talking about the performance of Piñera and his first term, and then the Bachelet government and sort of the changes. But the question is, Piñera had, 5%, there was 5% growth under Piñera's first term, and yet he was not a very popular president. And what explains that? Is there an ability to connect? Is there the perception of him, which I think is not irrelevant to how successful he's likely to be? In other words, he had 5%. He had good economic growth. Why didn't people support him and like him and approve him? Why is there that disjuncture? What's the issue there? I'll leave those 2 questions to think about, and then I'm going to invite others. Carlos, please just wait for the microphone and tell us who you are and brief.
Carlos Indacochea, sociologist. 2 disparate questions. One is, what is the role of voluntary voting here? And this is becoming crucial in terms of popular mandate. The other question is, economists are starting to discover, quote unquote, that distribution of income and wealth matters. And Chile is notorious for being, on the one hand, successful on growth and very disparate. How does that play into Piñera's prospective popularity in this administration?
Okay, inequality issue, sure. John? Let's get John, and then we'll go back to the panel for this.
John Dingus, Columbia University. I'm glad you mentioned distribution, because nobody on the panel mentioned distribution, and that continues to be an issue both in the elections and popularly. But I wanted to focus it on just an informational question, which I really don't understand, which is the tax structure. You mentioned corporate tax rates. As I understand it, the VAT is the vast majority of taxes that affect individuals. But what about the individual tax rate? And what about capital gains taxes? To what extent is that a real factor? And what about compliance with taxes? I understand that that's fairly loose. And then, so how does those elements of the tax structure affect the distribution of wealth, to follow up on your question?
Okay, why don't we start with those, if that's okay. Robert, you want to start?
Sure. The corruption, I mean, certainly corruption was very present. I guess I mentioned it indirectly when I mentioned Penta and how it affected Bachelet's popularity, but it's been present throughout the Bachelet administration, or these last 4 years, and it's become even more present in the last few weeks, as we've discovered we've had this scandal involving Carabineros and an investigation into the attacks that we've seen in the south of the country that have been ascribed to the Mapuche community, although now it seems that Carabineros appears to have doctored some of the evidence. And so, again, the issue of corruption. Also, sort of the higher-ranking generals, the Carabineros, have been accused of taking money and things. So, if you look at all the corruption scandals we've seen, at least in the last 4 years, although you could go back even further, we've seen corruption scandals affecting Carabineros, affecting business and politics and political parties, affecting the church, affecting the Football Association, was probably the most damaging. And I say that partly ironically, but partly not, because I think the net effect of all these corruption scandals is that they're not really about corruption at the end of the day. What's happening is that they're all contributing to a lack of confidence in public institutions. Carabineros was historically the institution that, if you look at any poll over time, the political institution or the institution with the highest degree of public confidence. And that's dropped precipitously over the last few months. And you add that to the way that the church has lost. Look at the visit of the Pope a month ago. There was a mass in Iquique, in his last public event in Chile. It was empty. It looked like Trump's inauguration. It was terrible. So the lack of confidence in the church, the lack of confidence in Carabineros, the lack of confidence in political parties, if you look at the sum of that, is very, very damaging for Chile, and that's what worries me about corruption. The role of voluntary voting, someone asked, you asked the role of voluntary voting. I was very involved. We actually with a bunch of colleagues, we put together a campaign pushing for the change towards voluntary voting. Most of those colleagues now will say that they were wrong. I refuse to say that I was wrong. We knew what we were doing. We knew the political science literature is very clear that, for example, voluntary voting favors wealthier, better educated voters and things like that. It wasn't, in my view, the debate wasn't about that. The debate was that the previous system was automatic registration, voluntary registration and obligatory voting. So if you look at the shift that happened between the old system and the new one, it's not so much. People blame voluntary voting, but at the end of the day, because now it's voluntary, at the end, essentially we have the same type of voter that voted before is voting now, with a slight emergence of these younger voters that have come in, and that we see that, for example, in the Frente Amplio. What we didn't have in the previous system, and we don't have in this system, is widespread voting amongst the poorest of our population, and that's something that needs to be addressed. My view on that has always been the problem is on the supply side, not on the demand side. It's what the political offer is. Who is speaking to those voters, and what's going to get those voters out to vote. I hope that doesn't end up being basically populism, but that's what. And just to address inequality, which was mentioned several times, it's my problem when I mean, certainly that's the argument, and Nicanor Parra, who died a few weeks ago, had this famous quip where he said, you know, I have one chicken, I have no chickens, and you have two chickens, and we have an income per capita of one chicken. But I'm still starving. So the fact that income per capita has increased the way that Sergio outlines is important, but it doesn't take into account the kind of inequality that we have, which clearly can only be addressed with, if you look around the world, Sergio can correct me, but how has income inequality been addressed in other places? It's through taxation, and some sort of redistribution. I don't see that there's any other way with the effects that we know, but that's the reality.
Thank you. Sergio.
All right, so let me start with, let me take inequality then. So first of all, I think, so when it comes to the inequality in Chile compared to the region, I don't think we are an outlier. So particularly because I think many countries in the regions do not measure inequality the way we do it. I mean, we are pretty good at generating good statistics of income inequality. To be honest, I think it's more important consumption inequality, and when you look at consumption inequality, you incorporate all the transfers and so on. I don't think Chile does that bad as the picture you might get by just looking at income inequality. Having said that, of course, income inequality is an issue, is high compared to Sweden. But do we want to compare Chile with Sweden? I mean, I don't know. That's an open question. Is it high compared to the US? Are those two systems comparable? I don't think so. So I think it plays an important role. But I really think what's going on here is not just the Gini coefficient or the tail coefficient. And I think this idea that, you know, the story was, so if you send your child to a good school, you are going to be able to have your kid attending a good university, and the kid is going to be doing well later on. Well, we know now that that's actually not true. That's not what is going on in Chile. And basically because, yeah, the logic is correct, but it turns out if you don't secure quality, it's going to be a waste of money. So for a large fraction of kids in the country, access to higher education has actually implied financial losses. They would have been better off not attending college once you take into account the cost and duration of the program. So where I'm going with this, so it's how to secure the transition. It's about the dynamic. It's not about the picture. It's about the move. It's not about the picture, right? I want to know if I am at the bottom of the distribution, what are my chances of scaling up, right, in the socioeconomic ladder? And there, I think we should be really focusing all of our efforts. And to be honest, when you look at the Bachelet initiatives, the program back in 2013, I mean, all the titles were the right ones. Check, I want to reduce inequality. I want to change taxes. I want better education, access to education. Check, check, check. They are all what you want. But then when you see how they were implemented, the results have been terrible. So free college. Seriously? For a country like Chile? We have other needs. That will cost 3 points of the GDP. We could be spending that money in early childhood. That's, when it comes to actual inequality, you worry about the long-term effects, that's the way you want to do it. We didn't do it that way. So I think the issue is how to eliminate unfair disparities. Not just focusing on a Gini coefficient. Is if you are a family that, I have a kid, he's talented, how do we secure that this kid is going to have access to motivation, is going to have access to high quality education, and so on. And by taking the colegios fuera de los patines, how Isaguirre said back in the day, when referred to the private education, I think that's the wrong way of thinking about eliminating those unfair disparities. Taxes, of course taxes are going to be important. There's no question about it. I mean, taxes are the way to think about, well, you want to act today, so what do we do? But if you look at taxes, income taxes on people, I mean, 80% of Chileans do not pay taxes. Zero. They're exempted. Zero. So sure, right? You get most of the revenues come out of VAT. That's correct. But what is the other side? I mean, it's just they don't pay any taxes. So compare that with Sweden. Compared to any European country, people pay taxes. And that's important because you get benefits and you pay for them. And there is some notion, even though you can get credits and subsidies and so on, but there's a clear equilibrium that I'm going to be paying, but I'm going to get something back. The problem is 80% of people, 75% of people do not pay taxes, income taxes, period. So when it comes to, for example, pensions, I mean, it will be very easy to solve or to increase pensions by just changing that exemption rate. So what is going to be the cutoff? You start paying taxes, you change it a little bit, you generate huge resources for the government. And I think that's something we should really get into it. Personal taxes increase at the top with Bachelet. There is a discussion whether or not you want to move it back a little bit. I don't think that's going to be feasible. I mean, it will be very hard to think, because of the reasons you mentioned, to think that might be something they will be doing. Capital gains, to what extent taxes on capital gains might really have long-term effects on inequality, I think that, to be honest, it's an empirical question. I don't think that's, when you see the results from the evidence, it's not clear that by just increasing capital taxes on capital gains, that will have a significant impact. Well, they did it, so we will see. And what we have seen from what they did, investment went down. I mean, that's as simple as that. Could you explain, the drop on GDP growth just by, these bad reforms? Probably not. Probably not. But, maybe 25%, half of it is due to this? I think so. Now, just to conclude, it's interesting to see, and this is part of Piñera's challenges. So people, and papers reading on this, the people claim that, access to higher education has explained, actually, the decline in inequality in Chile. And that's sort of the logic behind this. Let's give them access. Let's have kids just gain access to college. Let's make it free. Well, actually, if you look at the evidence, the inequality declined not only in Chile between 2000 and 2015. It declined everywhere in the region. And there's a good reason why. So what is the common factor affecting the region since 2000? Well, the commodity boom. The commodity boom basically represents an inverse technological change, boosting wages of those at the bottom. So that will, reduce inequality, not because of what's going on at the top, but it's going on at the bottom. As soon as the boom ends, now you're facing challenges, right? Because in Brazil, you were able to increase minimum wage massively. Colombia did the same. You generate these conditional and unconditional cash transfer programs using the resources you got from the commodity boom. When this ends, what happened? So the advantage of Chile and the advantage of Piñera is that in many ways, Congress stopped what we could have been done in Chile back in 2010 because of the earthquake, probably. That helps a lot, amazingly. So you contain expenditure. And with Bachelet, we got this tsunami of demands, and there was really no way of stopping it. And they start basically signing acts and giving money away. And we got it at the very end. The good thing is that's ending. So the commodity boom is gone. Chile is trying to recover of that situation. The issue is what happens if inequality starts looking bad, as it's supposed to be the case if strictly speaking, there are no structural reforms tackling those disparities. I think that's the main challenge when it comes to inequality, and it's something I'm sure Piñera and the people at the cabinet understand pretty clearly.
Thank you. Gabriel, you want to add anything?
I'll just make sort of as the Brazilian who works in Chile, I feel like I have to comment on the corruption thing for just 20 seconds. And it's just frustrating, right? Because in Brazil, we have exponentially greater levels of corruption, nothing gets done. In Chile, you have these cute little corruption scandals that actually get addressed immediately. And so, I think with the passage of the Ley de Lobby that passed a few years ago when the first scandal erupted, that really changed, I think, the narrative for how the Bachelet government engaged with industry. And what we saw was a trend where, frankly, officials were a lot more skittish about meeting with industry. There was sort of an overreaction, if you will, on that point. And when I was alluding this to a little bit in my comments, when I was saying industry is hoping that Piñera will be a little bit more open, I think that the pendulum may find its way a little bit back to the center after the events of the last few years. And I'll just mention the Carabinero scandal. Piñera has put Andres Chadwick as his interior minister. I think we can expect to see a real double down on compliance efforts under his leadership over the next few years as well, which I think is also a good thing. So anyway, as someone who works with Chile actually does resolve its problems, so or at least addresses them.
Thank you. We're going to take another round. We're going to start with Peter. We'll go over here, and then we'll go to Hernan. Peter, the microphone.
Thank you, Robert.
This is Peter Hakem.
Thank you, Peter Hakem. You talk a lot about the parties, but you didn't really talk about what happens to the Chilean party system, which has been stable for as long as I can remember to some extent. The Christian Democrats joined with the left in the last 25 years or so, but the Christian Democrats remained the Christian Democrats. The left-wing party stayed on the left. You had the right wing. And this was one of the most stable party systems in Latin America. And what happens now? Are the Christian Democrats over with? In other words, that's one question. The second question is nobody's really talked about Chilean foreign policy. Is there anything to it besides trade and international economics? Is there any role that Chile plays internationally that's going to change with Piñera?
Thanks. Why don't we have a question here?
Hi, I'm Amanda from BCIU, and thank you all for your time. This has been very enlightening. Gabrielle mentioned the need to respond to societal demands and balance that with fiscal pressures. And I think we spoke a little bit about distribution in general, but it focused mostly on economic distribution. I was wondering how you expect Piñera to balance this line, if you will, when it comes to decentralization, which is necessary for the country.
Great, thanks. Hernan?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talks, very interesting. Hernan Rosenberg with Development Outcomes. My wife has a business, helping people write their statements for college. And she has a very hard time explaining to Chileans that you don't have to write which is your high school, okay? Which in Chile is a major issue because, if you went to high school A, then, I can tell you where you're going to get your PhD. So, which brings you to the point. How much will the Piñera government be able to deal with this topic? I mean, the reason we have a certain organizational economics and everything else has to do with the fact that, that you were born in the right side of the track, you end up in the right side of the track. So, because, some of the parties in the coalition of Piñera don't want to change that. So how do you think that's going to work? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we start with Gabrielle this time, and Sergio and Robert will give you the last word.
I will. I think Piñera's foreign policy, I think, like many Latin American presidents, I think we can expect him to start focusing first on the region before beyond. I think his selection of his foreign minister really, I think, signals that Venezuela and Cuba will figure high, I would expect, on his foreign policy. He chose a writer that I think will bring a lot of credibility to the approach to some of that debate on handling the crisis in Venezuela and addressing the Cuba issue. I think in terms of the U.S., I don't expect major shifts. U.S. and Chile have a very deep, long partnership and diplomatic relationship. I think we are in an unusual time here in the United States and in this administration. So I'm going to watch very closely to see how Piñera approaches that and how he prioritizes a trip to the United States, which I think we can expect certainly, later this year. So I think those are some of my original thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks. Sergio?
All right. So let me, Amanda, decentralization. This is. Yeah, I forgot to mention this, but I really think that this is going to be a major issue right now. So now governments are going to be elected. We're going to be elected officials, and that changed the game. I mean, it used to be the case you have the intendentes, right? And the intendentes were people basically, they work for the government. So for those in La Moneda. So you will have that under control. But now you will have each region, right? You will have these governors, and they will start requesting resources, demanding resources. And what is interesting from the new law is that they got nothing. So what is going to be interesting is to see how the government can balance these elected officials, right? Providing them with funding to keep them sort of doing what they were supposed to be doing, although initially they got zero funding. And that, I think, is going to be part of a major reform, which is going to be part of the Piñera's legacy, I think, the modernization of the states. That's something that is coming. I think there is an agreement within the future administration that many of the reforms implemented under Bachelet suffer from the lack of coordination between different entities within the government. So if you want to change pensions, you want to have the people at the labor minister working with those at the finance minister. And that turns out it's really hard. They don't share data, they don't share information, they don't share perspective. So I think decentralization it's going to be one of these components of this major umbrella of modernization. So now with respect to equality opportunities, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something, I was sort of referring to when I mentioned this idea of an open access society. This is going back to Douglas North, the Nobel Prize economist. And Chile, the problem in Chile is that that's actually quite important still. I mean, depending on where you not only high school, I mean, you can now go to kinder. And it makes total sense, right? If you find an economy in which really is all about signals, well, go and check tuition in kindergarten. It's extremely expensive for this super fancy kindergarten. And why do they tell you? Well, I tell you, look, it turns out 80% of the kids that attend this school end up attending this other high school. So that's sort of the branding of these places. So how to change this? So I think, again, there is a clear notion that this is a major issue when it comes to development in general, not only economic, but socioeconomic development. Unfortunately, I think what they did back, under Bachelet, it made things even worse. So it used to be the case that you have access to voucher school, you could contribute a little bit, the quality was okay, but at least you were able to sort of buy something better than the public school. Under this administration, things are even worse now because basically you either go to a private school and you pay, $1,000 per month, or public education where you have, it's basically free, but there's no quality assurance or anything like that. So now we will have a segregation and will increase. We have seen this in higher education, and it's going to start happening in middle, high school, and high school, and elementary school. And so what we need to do about this? So I really think that reverting some of the changes, which might not imply changes in law, providing private voucher schools the opportunity to continue functioning some level the way we're doing it before, but more importantly, I think teachers. So the real challenge is how to attract good students to the teaching career. That's going to take a long time, but if you really want to secure equal opportunities in a context of a country like Chile, that's the way to go. Forcing the good teachers to work in the poor areas. We know where they are. I can tell you exactly, if give me your test scores in 4th grade, I can tell you your chances of ending up in medicine at the Catholic University. I know that if you're in the bottom 10% of the worst schools, and the bottom of the test score distribution back in 4th grade, your chances of attending the Catholic University, 0. That's a fact. And I know that in my computer, imagine what the government could do. The information is available. They could do much better. So going back to targeting, going back not only to cash transfers, but securing quality for the kids that really need. We know where they are. We know where parents are. We know where or not they have contact with the government. They go to the public clinics and so on. That's what you need to do to actually break down, a closed economy, a closed society, which is what I think we still have in Chile.
Thank you, Sergio. Robert, I think Peter had a question for you. It's one of the questions on this session is, will Piñera's second term possibly mark the last gasp of Chile's traditional party system? Well, which is, that's where you got it, yeah. Okay. That's what I figured. I just want to make it clear for the record that that's where you got it.
He's reading the answer.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. Well, I want to thank you for your concision.
I think, the problem is whoever is left with the party system will be the person or the people or the parties that are best able to adapt to this new world where left, center, and right don't mean anything. My worry is that those people, not only in Chile, but we've seen in other places, tend to be populists. Chile historically has been somewhat immune to populism, but I think there are worrying signs. I think the Casts and the Osandons, and even Bachelet to some point, are signs that the Chilean voters are more receptive to populist messages. But I think the problem is, and what's quite extraordinary, because this has been going on for some time, is that the traditional parties that you mentioned, the Christian, I've said this in many panels. In the 2009 election, when Eduardo Frei was running again, I said the problem with Frei is that he's a president from the 90s with a last name from the 60s who belongs to a party from the 1930s. And here we are 10 years later, and it's still a party from the 1930s. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that the Christian Democratic Party, which has everything to gain from being in the center, from having this kind of flexibility, ideological flexibility, has not undergone a more profound process of ideological renovation, reflection, and so on, similar to what the left did some time ago. It's also extraordinary to me that the right hasn't done that either. And that you have, the UDI, that I think the UDI is changing partly because of the generational shift. Younger UDI, I remember once speaking to Joaquin Lavín, and I said, how does your party deal with a country? You look around the country and you see a country that's open to divorce, that's open to abortion, that's open to gay marriage, that's open to all these things that are anathema to you. And he said, honestly, I have this discussion with my son, who's now in Congress, because they don't care about these things. To them, those are not issues, and it's going to resolve itself when that generation takes over. And that's beginning to happen. But I think for the traditional parties, there are very few signs that they have any ability or intention of undergoing that kind of change. And I think that'll leave a vacuum that I'm afraid will be filled by populists, especially in the context of the new electoral system. There's another point. Chile has this strange, we like to adopt, Sergio mentioned that we needed to come up with our own model in order to resolve the inequality issue. Chile has this thing where we tend to copy models a lot from other places. And so now what we have the situation is that we've copied everything. So we have this strange situation which is not very common in political systems, where we have a first and second round presidential system and primaries, both. Normally you have primaries and then just one round. You don't do both. And what that does is, both those scenarios, what they do is enable extremes, right? We've seen it here. Here we know we have the more extreme language in primaries, and then it kind of gets settled after the convention and the candidate shift to the center, except in the last few months. But normally that's what happens. We have primaries and first rounds and second rounds, and we have the situation where we've basically got rid of all our incentives to shift this to the center. Chilean foreign policy. I was going to mention, I ran out of time. I think Piñera is going to have the first crisis that he'll have will be the decision in The Hague regarding Bolivia. And I say crisis because it's almost sure, that it'll be a challenge. And I think I'm very surprised by his choice of foreign minister. Not only will he have a difficult time with that, he's going to have, what strikes me most about Ampuero is the foreign ministry in particular is very difficult because it's one of the few ministries where really you have in the Chilean context a permanent staff as opposed to other ministries. And it's a very tough ministry internally. It's a ministry that for as long as I can remember people have been talking, ministers come in and say we're going to modernize the foreign ministry. And there they are. So I think that's going to be a challenge. There's another issue that I think is key for Chile and for the region, which is the role of the insertion of non-traditional actors, such not only China, but Iran. I was talking to someone recently. There's a journalist who writes in the Radio Universidad Chile website who is Chilean, but he's paid for by this Hispan TV, which is funded by Iran. I think that's the tip of the iceberg of the kind of new challenge that we're seeing, especially, and this is the other thing I was going to mention, in this new world where the United States is, at least for the time being, not the lead actor in the region. How does a country like Chile, I think it's a big challenge for Chile, and I'm not sure Ampuero will know how to deal with it. How does it move in this new world where the United States is not taking the lead? And I think what they did is, Heraldo, I've been quite critical, but I think in this, Heraldo Munoz has been very, very adept, is taking the lead, took the lead in TPP. So there's opportunities there for a country like Chile. But the challenge is, Chile's a small country that's always dependent on a multilateral system, and you now have, an American government which doesn't really believe in that. So I think that's going to be a challenge going forward. And the last bit regarding how do you deal with where you were born or not born. I was born in Chile, but I lived most of my life in Canada, and I went back to Chile, and within months, for the first time in my life, I heard the expression, "Who do you think you are?" Que te has creído? In an academic discussion. And it was a good lesson for me of where I was operating. And I think the right in particular, Chileans in general don't get it, the right in particular doesn't get it. The issue that you're mentioning is something that for the right, it's not on their horizon, even though so many of them studied abroad. And the best example of that is look at the composition of the new cabinet. Look at the schools they went to. Look at what they look like. At least the Nueva Mayoría, there's a kind of a salute to the flag, right? So you say, well, we'll have some women, and maybe some of them will even have brown hair, and they won't be blonde. But you know, for the right, it's just not even on the horizon. There's not even a show of doing that, and that's particularly worrying because of things that Sergio has studied regarding how that affects competitiveness, how that affects, you know, if you don't have women on your boards. There's all sorts of studies in Chile regarding, you know, minority presence. I mean, forget about Mapuches or anything, you know, going beyond just the very basic minorities like women. You know, the other day, President Lagos spoke. In Chile, we have this Consejo de Relaciones Internacionales. And I went, Ricardo Lagos spoke. And I went, and I'm not exaggerating. There were maybe 150 people in the audience. I counted, there were 3 women. And the average age, you know, I mean, I think Sergio Vitad brought down the average age of the people in the audience. And that's the world that we live in. And I think that if you look at how the United States moved forward on that, it moved forward with legislation. It doesn't happen by itself.
Robert, thank you. This has been a terrific session. I'm sorry we've gone 5 minutes over, but I think we really shed a lot of light on what we could expect. We'll be listening to President Piñera's speech on March 11th and the first 100 days and see what he does. And we hope you'll come back and continue to share your perspective with us, because I think it's going to be very, very interesting and very important. Gabriel, Sergio, Robert, thank you all very, very much. And thank you all for coming.